Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to episode 6 of Business Jam Live, the live stream that brings you all sorts, basically. Today we have got a very interesting show for you, and I have to get the joke in first. It's not rocket science. I had to do that. I'm sorry. You'll find out what the in joke is later. If you're on LinkedIn, if you're on Facebook, if you're on YouTube, you can make comments and I can pick them up here and we'll display them on the screen, or you can ask questions. So if you want to ask our guest questions, please do, and we'll get that done. The only thing I have to say, if you're on Facebook, can you please go to this URL? Because otherwise what will happen is you'll appear on our screen as Facebook user rather than Fred Blogs or whatever your name is. So if you just go to that URL, that will sort that little problem out for us. So I think it's time to introduce my guest. So my guest today, he's founding director of Nixon Publishing Limited and the editor of the Nixon Journal, which is, it sounds unexciting, but it is exciting, actually. A monthly publication for international subscribers and provides clarity and insight into the fast-moving worlds of graphene and 2D materials. And when you hear what our guest has to say about that, you will realize that that really is true. He's also a member of the board of directors of the International Space Elevator Consortium, hence the rocket science joke, and an advisory council member of Stellar Model, the Space Transportation Association. So please welcome this week's guest, Adrian Nixon. Hello, Adrian.
Hello, Derek. Nice to see you.
I'm sorry, I just had to get that joke in. It's at least it's over and done with now. That's the point. The elephant is no longer in the room. So you've come a long way to where you are now. So, but where did you start out?
Oh gosh, how far back would you like me to go?
I don't just the potted history of your route that tells us how you got to where you are now.
Okay, right. Just very high speed look through my career because I'm just a little bit more than 21 now. Started off as I left school and started off as a laboratory scientist, a laboratory technician, and studied science and chemistry part-time at college, and then did ONC, HNC, then a degree in chemistry at Huddersfield University, and then, well, it was Polytechnic then. And I became a member of the Royal Society of Chemistry by examination. And that's in the days when that was the way to get in, and then became a chartered chemist. I got a job as a chemist in working for a big international chemicals company called Allied Colloids that became CBER and is now part of BASF. And I was with them probably for about 13, 14 years, something like that, wearing a white coat, inventing things, doing tech service, working with big industry, paper industry, pollution control industry, that sort of thing. I ran tech service, I ran quality control for a while, I ran paper R&D for a while, and then I did an MBA, and then sort of leapfrogged the system and went into senior management, became global market information manager for the company, which is great. Built a knowledge management system, front-ended a system called SAP that you're probably aware of, these big computers that run businesses. And then company got taken over. I got offered a job in Switzerland. I decided it wasn't really for me and left the company and went to work for a big consulting company, one of the big 6 consulting companies in the world. Spent a little bit of time with them, being picked up and put down in different countries all over the world, usual sort of consulting stuff. Got a bit bored of that, and then left them and set my own consulting company up called Nixon Limited in 2002, doing strategy, business planning, that sort of thing for businesses. And over the years, I started to find that I was briefing top management about the things I found really interesting, and boards and chief execs were less interested in the stuff that I was getting more interested in. And it took me an age to realise that the difference was that I'm dealing with things that are more than 5 years into the future. And as you're probably well aware, the average lifespan of a chief exec is about 5 years. And so anything longer than that, they're not really that motivated in, because it's somebody else's problem. So I ended up with a lot of stuff on my cutting room floor. All sorts of trends, future trends, scientific, economic, business trends, that sort of thing. And I gathered all this stuff up together and figured out what to do with it. So I ended up going around mainly the UK doing presentations to MBAs and universities, sort of interactive presentations about what the future holds, that sort of thing. And one of the things which kept cropping up on the radar and gradually got more and more important in my eyes was this new material called graphene. And being a chemist, I realised this is something quite, one, it's fascinating, it's really easy to understand on one side, and then got a heck of a lot of complexity, and I could see this was really going places, and that gradually took over more and more and more. I ended up writing a financial blog for a Canadian company called Investor Intel, and that got quite popular, seemed to get a lot of attention there. And then I got commissioned to write a consultancy piece briefing a company on a regular basis about graphene and this world of 2D materials. And it sort of grew from there, and I got together with a bunch of colleagues, and we suddenly realised this might be actually quite a good product. So almost by accident, we ended up creating the journal and setting up a publishing company. That was about 5 years ago. But since then, we've been producing every month a briefing document for customers, which is about 50 pages. And we condense all the scientific stuff, technical stuff, one item to a page, just one page. There's a graphic, it says what it is, who's doing the work, why it's important, and then at the bottom there's a relevance box, which is basically the so what. So in a couple of bullet points you can actually see what the relevance is, and is this something I need to be interested in or not, for a variety of reasons. And that's become really quite valued by our customers. And now we found we've got customers, some of the biggest companies in the world, and scattered all over, and we've got a viable business which is now going from strength to strength. So, yeah,
in a way, your journal has become, I guess, almost the modern equivalent of the New Scientist.
Well,
because
yeah.
I can remember when I had a real job, I don't know how many years ago, 10, 20 years ago, then people read the New Scientist for scientific stuff.
Yeah.
And I guess that's it. So
Yeah,
for some of the people who actually might be listening in, watching, who aren't quite as heavily into 2D materials as they're going to be in half an hour's time, what are some of, I mean, you mentioned to me the other week some of the interesting things that can be done with it, the sort of things that would hit the headlines, the toaster or whatever. Some of those things that are a bit more obvious than elevators.
Well, I can go into the detail of it a little bit more, but just a few headlines. So graphene is already being used to make concrete stronger, and you follow the logic through, and you can use less concrete, and it will take, well, concrete is responsible for about 8% of global CO2 emissions. So if you can make concrete, in this case, at least 25% stronger and probably more, then you can take 2% off global CO2. If you switched to graphene in concrete tomorrow, you could do that. And we don't have to change our lifestyle one jot. That's one example. Graphene is already in cars that are on the road. It's actually being used to make the roads themselves. And actually, just last week, I was looking at the latest data coming from trials in the UK, and it looks like graphene is going to make road surfaces last 70% longer. That's just this tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more to talk about.
Tell me about the toaster, though, because I was fascinated.
There is, right. We'll return to this because the viewers probably need to see what graphene is and how it's used. But basically, graphene has been used to make a toaster, which is transparent. So it's basically got two transparent plates. You can put electric current in, and it turns that electricity into infrared radiation, and you can toast. Literally, you can make toast in a shorter amount of time using less power than a normal grill would. And there's been a working prototype demonstrated at the Consumer Electronics Show in January in California this year.
But that highlights it. Well, first of all, it sort of captures me on two levels. One is I'm the sort of person, and I can remember doing it many years ago, buying a new washing machine and watching the tub go round. I used to do that. Lots of people have done that. Now, I would love to watch bread toast. That's fascinating.
And that is one of the selling points of this toaster. Yeah,
but it does sort of highlight, another one of the sorts of properties. You've got strength properties. You've got, electrical conduction property. You've got, this stuff is incredible. So tell us more about the stuff.
Right, yes, let's start off then. Graphene is carbon. So there's some graphene for you. And this is made by a company called Graphene CR. And there are a number of ways of making it. The reason I'm showing you this one is because this is made from biochar. So it's crop waste. And that's been turned into graphene. Quite a lot of graphene tends to come from, because it's carbon, the stuff in pencils. So graphite in pencils is basically, you can think of graphite as having lots of layers all stacked up on top of one another, like a deck of playing cards. And what graphite is, lots of these individual decks of playing cards all jumbled up together. And how graphite was first found was graphene is just one of those layers in that pack of cards, if you're following the analogy. Are you with me so far, Derek?
I'm with you so far.
Good. Right. So if you take a piece of graphite, this is an experiment that was done in 2004. So now you can imagine you've got that stack of playing cards of graphite, and if you put the graphite first onto a layer of sticky tape, and then you put some more sticky tape on the top, and then pull them apart, you've cleaved the pack. Yep. And if you keep on doing that about 17 times, eventually what you'll do is you'll split the pack, split the pack, split the pack, and eventually you get down to the point where there's just one layer left. And that is graphene. So it's just pure carbon. And I'll talk more about exactly what it is in a minute. But two scientists in Manchester, Andrei Geim and Kostya Novoselov, did this work just playing part of their Friday night experiments at Manchester University. And they found that they could, first of all, isolate graphene as this one atomic layer of carbon. That had never been done before, and it was thought impossible to do that work. Now, that got them a bit of attention, but what really captured everybody's attention was when they started to look at what the properties of graphene were, they suddenly found this material that they'd isolated was incredibly strong. So when they tried to pull it apart, they found that it was so strong, it was 200 times stronger than steel. So then they thought, well, what else can we find? So they looked at the electrical properties and found it conducts electricity at least 6 times better than copper. How does it conduct heat? Well, it's one of the world's best conductor of heat. It's transparent, one atomic layer. It's flexible. It's also pretty much indestructible. If you try to melt it, nobody's actually been able to get the temperature high up enough yet to do this experiment because it's the highest melting point ever known. So whatever you put it in will melt. The latest computer models say it will melt somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 degrees centigrade in a vacuum. So this stuff could sit on the surface of the sun and it would still be fine. It's untearable. And people keep finding more properties. So this has only happened in the last 2 years. Some work was done getting a piece of graphene and putting it over a little well, and then having a very expensive, very sharp stick called an atomic force microscope basically something that prods the surface. And so you've got this this one atomic layer of graphene suspended over this hull with this very fine sharp stick pointing it, and you can measure the number of oscillations it takes. Now, normally materials will fall apart probably after a few thousand cycles of being prodded and poked. It's fatigue resistance. It took graphene over 1 billion cycles before it failed. So it's the world's most fatigue resistant material. And then cap that about the same time a couple of years ago. Again, this is work done by Andre Geim at the University of Manchester. They put the graphene over the top of these wells, but then put gases inside the well in these perfectly sealed wells, and checked to see how long it took for the gases inside to escape. And they found the smallest gas atom is helium. And you've probably seen helium balloons, Derek. You know, when you fill them up, if you leave them around after a party, after a day or so, they look a bit sad, don't they? They start to deflate. The reason is the helium gas can actually percolate through the material of the plastic, and it's very difficult stuff to contain. And helium is so small, it can percolate through anything. So it's very, very difficult to contain it. Turns out graphene is this one atomic layer of graphene. The researchers at Manchester found that it is equivalent to a kilometre thick wall of glass. It's that impermeable to helium, which is astonishing.
Is it the case then that when the material is actually that thin, that I mean, it's a bit like packing snooker balls together. You can get them as close together as you can, but if you have them in a jumbled up pile, then you leave some gaps. But I was just thinking, we're not going to make graphene balloons, because I imagine the cost would be quite prohibitive. But can you do things like that? Can you make complex shapes out of graphene?
Very good point. Let's come back to how graphene's made then to start off with. So and I'll answer that question in a minute, because you need to know about the different types of graphene. So the stuff I've talked about already was making graphene from biomass with these powders. And then you can also make it from graphite. Do you remember we talked about that sticky tape method? But there's another method you can use. Peeling apart those decks of cards is called exfoliation. And that results in these black powders for graphene. But you can also do it another way. So if you get the graphite in a pencil, well, pure graphite, and you put it into an electrochemical cell, then you can pass an electric current through. And if you get the chemistry right, you can get various molecules to go inside the platelets, and then the electric current forces them apart. And this is one I made earlier. So yeah, I made this. This is graphene nanoplatelets, and it's a dark black liquid. There's graphene in there, and you can add that to all sorts. Again, being a chemist, I can play with these things. So that's graphene can be made as a powder or as a liquid. And people, when they first saw that, they thought, well, maybe graphene powders, they're not that impressive, because, you know, 200 times stronger than steel, and it's world's best, world's best, world's best, world's best. It's got so many different properties all in one material that as soon as you see these powders, you get a little bit disappointed. By the way, there's something else I forgot to mention. Do you remember the two scientists I talked about, Andre and Kostya, in University of Manchester?
Yeah, indeed.
When they isolated graphene and found all these properties, then in 2010, they won the Nobel Prize for the discovery, which is pretty cool. That got a huge amount of attention. And these black powders started to attract, and liquids started to attract people's attention. So people then grabbed hold of these samples and started to put them into stuff. So they put them into plastics, they put them into sensors and all sorts of things. And a huge amount of activity shot up. There was a great deal of expectation in the 2010s, and it made things worse. Everything that they put graphene in failed, more or less, in those early days. And everybody lost hope. Now, Derek, you're familiar with the hype cycle. So when something new comes along, the expectations get raised, people dive in, and then you don't really understand how to apply this stuff, and things start to fail very quickly. And this is one of the things I learned in my time as running research, R&D, is you think research is all about clever ideas and successful application of things. Actually, R&D is more about managing failure and going through that, because most of the things you play with don't work. It's just one or two things do, and you've got to be a bit creative. And it turns out the creativity in this, my colleague Debbie Nelson summed this up far better than I did. She realized that the people who are successful applying these powders into the concretes and polymers and things I've been talking about already, what they did was they did something counterintuitive. You add this in and it makes it worse. So you add more and it makes it worse, even more worse. So what the people who found the success of this have done is the counterintuitively was you add less. And it turns out less is more. And the thing Debbie said was, it's a bit like adding salt to your food. If you bung a load of salt in, it'll make it taste horrible.
Yeah.
But if you put a little touch in, that just makes the difference between something bland and something rather tasty. And there's something similar going on with graphene. And
I guess in a way, Adrian, that's the fact that you have to add less is good, because I imagine that graphene is not a cheap material either.
It wasn't in the early days. It's becoming a lot cheaper now. So this material here, the stuff I'm holding in my hand, probably that would have, in the early days of graphene, probably talk about £10,000, something like that. Now you're getting down, I can't tell you how much the company sells this for, but you're now getting in terms of tens of dollars, between tens of dollars and hundreds of dollars per kilogram. But interestingly, with the graphene in concrete in particular, because you are adding this graphene in tiny quantities and getting such a big effect, you're able to lower the cost of the finished product. So in effect, it doesn't matter what the price of this is, because the end result is that you're making a cheaper product. So the amount of graphene, the amount of money you're spending on graphene is sort of irrelevant. So
indeed,
that's powders so far, and it's probably worthwhile just take a break there. I just want to talk about the chemistry of graphene a little bit more. I've already said it's made of carbon, and we've talked about graphite, and here's some of my molecular models, which I just love showing people on screen.
Here's one I prepared earlier.
Indeed, yeah. And remember I talked about graphite being like decks of cards. So this is a 3-layer deck of cards, if you like. And you can see here the graphene itself is like a flat hexagonal structure. And these are the individual layers. They're held together with what are called van der Waals forces, which we might talk about a little bit later. These are quite weak forces that just hold it together. So that's graphite. And when you're exfoliating it, you're peeling these layers apart. This is graphite made of carbon. This one is another form of carbon. And can you see here that it's now a 3-dimensional structure rather than these flat planes? That is diamond. So diamond and graphite and carbon soot are all made of the same thing. It's just the atoms are arranged in different ways. And you know how strong diamond is. Well, graphene has a lot of the same strength characteristics. If we look at a sheet of graphene now, you can see here that the molecule just extends out, forming this hexagonal chicken wire. And these bonds here are some of the strongest in nature. I mean, I can't pull this apart. I put it together. These are little clip joints that put it together. That's why graphene is so strong. And if you can make these sheets larger and larger and larger, make a continuous, what's called a single crystal of graphene, then you can start to do amazing things with it. So you can move away from powders, and you can make large sheets which go on to centimeter and meter scale. And people have started to do this already. So we talked about the powders. Now this is something called Cvd Graphene. It stands for chemical vapor deposition graphene. You have to take my word for it, Derek, but on the sheet of copper foil here, is a 1 atom thin layer of graphene at that sort of scale here. We're talking about probably about 7 square centimeters here. That's covering the surface of the copper. And while this is polycrystalline at the moment, this is sort of got joins in, a bit like a patchwork quilt. Work is now underway, and there are people around the world at the moment who can make what's called a single crystal, where a single molecule stretches over the entire surface of the copper foil. So that stuff is something then you can start to peel off the copper, layer up, and then start to make all sorts of interesting structures out of. And that becomes a really, really interesting material, which goes way beyond the impressive stuff that we've got with powders already. That sort of give you a rough idea about the 2 types of graphene.
Indeed, it does. It looks like I've managed to. That's better. People don't want to see me; they want to see you. Yeah, I mean, it is a fascinating, and I can just imagine that everywhere, all over the world, people going, "No, I wonder what we can do with it."
Yeah, they are. Yeah,
but who on earth thought of the space elevator? I mean, it's a great idea, and I've heard people talk about it, and I've seen the documentation, and it all sounds far too possible. So what part? Well, first of all, what part does graphene play in this thing?
right.
And in fact, maybe I better let you explain the space elevator before explaining the part that graphene plays in it.
Right, I'll take your lead and do the space elevator first. We'll return back to graphene, and because you'll understand why graphene is important. It's probably worthwhile mentioning just at the start of this, Derek, that the space elevator found me. I didn't go looking for it, and as a result of the work that I'm involved with. So, space elevator. It's actually the main way of getting into space is with a rocket. So you sit on a tube filled with highly explosive and dangerous materials that basically explode or want to escape out the bottom end. And Newton's third law is it? Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Yeah. So if you throw stuff out one way, you go another way. And that's how a rocket works. A bit like if you've got a balloon, you blow up and then release the end without tying the knot in, the air comes out and the balloon goes flying around the room. That's roughly how rockets work. Rockets were invented, there's a debate about who originally invented them. The Chinese probably 1,000 or so, maybe a bit more years ago. But the concept of rockets as we know them today was probably done by the Russians and the Americans about 100 or so years ago. And there's a chap called Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. He was a Russian physicist who created something called the rocket equation, which monitors, or basically it tells you how a rocket performs as it goes from the ground up to up into orbit. And we all know about rockets. Seen Elon Musk playing around with them, Jeff Bezos, NASA, the Russian Space Agency, ESA, all these different space agencies around the world. They're a thing of fairly popular and immediate attention-grabbing stuff. However, around the time that rockets were being invented, then Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, if I've pronounced his name right, he also came up with an idea which was founded by looking at the Eiffel Tower. And he suddenly realized that if you could build an Eiffel Tower, which was the tallest structure in the world at the time, out of iron, then what would happen if you just kept on building? Could you actually build a tower that would eventually go up into space, and therefore you'd just climb up the tower and you'd be in orbit? It turns out that wasn't quite good enough because as you build higher and higher and higher, you're adding more weight to the structure, and the compressive forces will squish you down. And if your material is strong enough, you'll end up being squished into the surface of the Earth. So for one reason or another, towers don't work. But following that, there was some work done by NASA and Jerome Pearson in the 1960s and 70s, and alongside a chap called Arthur C. Clarke, who you might have heard of, a famous physicist and science writer. He wrote 2001: Space Odyssey. But he also, about the same time as Jerome and NASA, was working on the idea of geostationary satellites. And he suddenly realized that if, rather than building a tower, if you have a geostationary satellite, so you put a satellite onto a rocket, launch it up, and the rocket goes up and then sideways to match the rate at which the Earth's turning, and you make the satellite turn speed up very fast, so it's always above the same point of the Earth. So if we launched a geostationary satellite from here and went up, it would be, the satellite would be above us all the time because it's turning at the same speed as we are. So now we've got the satellite locked in orbit above us, geostationary orbit. What would happen if you get a piece of material and drop it all the way down from that satellite down to the ground, anchor it at the ground, then you've now got a permanent connection between the surface of the Earth and space. So now you can climb up the material and be in space. It sounds a bit like science fiction, but it isn't. There are serious rocket scientists working on this. NASA's worked on this. And at the turn of the century, which sounds a long time ago now, but the late 1990s and early 2000s, NASA commissioned a feasibility study, and they said, look, once and for all, just tell us, is this doable with today's technology or not? And they gave a guy called Bradley Edwards, who really smart rocket scientist, some funds to go away, talk to people who are creating materials, look at all the people who are creating engineering and say, is a space elevator doable with the technology that we've got today? Surprisingly, Bradley Edwards reported back, yes, this is doable. We've got all the technology for the stuff on the surface of the Earth. So you don't actually build it on the ground, you build it on the sea because you can move it about a bit. And oil technology for oil platforms, mobile platforms and stuff exists back in the mid-70s. And it's been evolving since then. So that's all doable. Launching stuff up into space, we've built the International Space Station. There's already 500,000 kilograms of material up there. So getting stuff up into space is no problem. And so we've got the ground bit, we've got the top bit, and then there was the material you make the what's called the tether out of. This is the material that connects the Earth to space. And you have to have a machine which clamps onto that material and then pulls itself up. So an elevator in a normal building has what are called elevator ropes, which are basically wires which wind around a drum at the top of the building, and then they unwind to lower the elevator and wind to pull it back up. A space elevator tether works differently. The material stays still, and the elevator cage clamps onto it and then pulls itself up and down. And all the technology exists to make that space elevator cage today. And I know because I'm working with a group that's actively looking at this. The only thing, material, which is holding things up is the material to make the tether out of. So it needs to be incredibly long and incredibly strong. And none of today's super strong materials are strong enough to make that. So things like Kevlar will just fall apart. And think about the problem here from the point of view, let's do an imaginary thought experiment. So if you're standing on top of an infinitely high cliff and you're super strong, and you've got some really strong steel or whatever it is, a rope in your hand, and you're paying it out over the edge of the cliff, it's fine as you start off. But that material that's dangling over the edge of this long, long, long cliff, the more you pay out, the more weight is pulling on your hands as you're holding it. And eventually what you'll do is you will overcome what's called the breaking length. So there's so much material dangling down and it has so much weight that it overcomes the tensile strength of the material and breaks and pulls apart. That's the problem of today's materials. And about 2003, just remember that date, Bradley Edwards reported the second phase of his work and said, everything is doable, just one thing, it's a materials problem. That's the only thing that's holding the space elevator up. And this, he said, at the time, the only material that was strong enough was something called carbon nanotubes. Now, carbon nanotubes are made out of carbon, and they're a cousin of graphene. Basically, you can think about this rolled up into a tube, and you now have this super strong tubes, these fibers, if you like, and they were the ideal material to make the space elevator tether out of. And a lot of interest and activity went into looking at carbon nanotubes. The problem is at the time of the NASA study, nobody's ever been able to make these in any great length. So typically most manufacturing processes of the time made them in millimeter lengths, 2-3 millimeters, that sort of thing. The longest that have been made in bundles so far is about 140 millimeters, 14 centimeters. So the work on carbon nanotubes stalled, and therefore the work on the space elevator stalled. That was 2004. 2003. Now remember, Andre and Kostya, when they did their experiments and looked at the strength of graphene, they reported in 2004, just 1 year after NASA abandoned the materials science and the space elevator, graphene came into the picture. And since then, it's been sort of lying around quite quietly in the background. But now, graphene has started to be made in longer and longer and longer lengths. Do you remember this material I talked about? This was made by a company called Groltex in California. And they're making graphene on copper foil at the minute. They can actually separate the graphene off. But now there are other companies in America, in Canada, in Europe they've now developed what are called roll-to-roll processes making graphene in continuous lengths. And graphene can now be made in lengths up to 1 kilometer long at speeds of approaching 2 meters a minute already. And hardly anybody realizes this at the moment. That's that Cvd graphene I talked about. So you can begin to see now, we're not in the position where we could make a space elevator tether tomorrow, and the tether would actually be made out of sheets of graphene, continuous molecules of graphene, basically, going from the surface of the Earth right out into space. And you would make a tether which would be approximately 500 millimeters wide, maybe broadening out to 1 meter wide, made of about 12,000 layers of graphene all clamped together. And that would be strong enough to take a 20-ton climber to clamp onto it and haul itself up. And that's what I'm working on. Does that sort of give you an idea about the space elevator and graphene, Dave?
Oh, it does. I mean, I'm one of the converted. I'm gonna be the first person onto the elevator.
And seriously, I'm working on the science of this and doing the materials science. And the stuff I'm seeing and monitoring, the pace of change in this in manufacturing of graphene is moving at such a pace that I think this is doable in our lifetimes. I genuinely do.
I've also got the vision of something. I mean, I know it'll be used for pulling satellites up to orbit and things like that. But I've also got this vision of it being almost like a theme park ride. This climber actually just having lots of seats and people in spacesuits, and that'd be the ultimate drop, wouldn't it, from orbit down to the Earth?
Well, you can actually go on a simulator because you know the Epcot Center in Disney World in Florida. They do the Epcot. I can't remember what it stands for, but it does showcases all the latest technologies. But there is something called the Space 220 restaurant, and you get into an elevator in the building, and inside that elevator you're surrounded by plasma screens. And it gives you the illusion of going up in the space elevator, doing exactly what you're talking about. And then at the end of the ride, you get out into the restaurant, which has these great big, I've never seen TV screens as big as this. They're vast. And they show a picture of the Earth from space and then various things flying past, Disney characters and things like that. But apparently the illusion is pretty real.
Yeah, I can imagine. So if there is anybody out there listening, please feel free to pass some comments and ask questions like, what else can you use graphene for apart from toasters?
Lots.
But just out of interest, what apart from energy saving in things like toasters, what part could graphene play in making and helping us with our energy problems, making the world a greener place, or reducing energy consumption?
Well, yeah, where to begin? The shorter question to answer is what can graphene not do? So if we just look at energy to start off with, already we're seeing now a company in the US that just come out of the secret phase. They've been working in secret now for about 3 or 4 years, and they've developed a graphene enhanced lithium ion battery. Now, batteries need to do three things. So they need to store a lot of energy in a given space or for a given mass. It's called the energy density. They need to charge and recharge fast, and they need to last a long time. So those basic three things. Lithium-ion batteries have been much better than normal batteries at storing lots of charge in a small space. But the problem is, as you know from electric cars, they're still not good enough to take us any reasonable distance. We've got this range anxiety. So the only way you can go further is add more batteries. Now, so anything that increases the energy density of the battery is going to be really important. And lithium-ion batteries have sort of hit a brick wall in terms of energy density. Nobody's really been able to improve them very much. Literally just a few months ago, this US company came out of its secret project, and they've already, using graphene, they've been able to increase the energy density by 3 times already, which is quite staggering. And so that means our cars will be able to go 3 times the distance for the same amount of batteries.
And yeah, who knows where that'll end.
Yeah. Now, there's another way of doing energy storage is there's something called supercapacitors. Now, they store energy as a charge rather than lithium-ion batteries storing it as ions, basically. And they found that by putting graphene onto the plates of the supercapacitor and rolling these things up, you can get supercapacitors that can store more energy and charge and discharge more efficiently. There's a company called Skeleton in Estonia. They've had about 120 million euros of funding over the last year. They've been developing what's called KERS systems. This is kinetic energy recovery systems. So when you put your foot on the brake, normally the energy dissipates as heat, but in electric cars, you can use that braking energy to charge up your batteries, or in this case, a supercapacitor. A bit like a dynamo on the back of a wheel of a push bike, if you remember them. And
too young, I don't know about those. Yes, I know them very well. Yeah,
Formula 1 cars use them.
Yes,
but also quite mundane things like trams. So electric trams in cities now, Skeleton are now supplying the supercapacitors to store the electrical energy in the KERS system. So they're supplying the graphene supercapacitors for the trams in Warsaw, I think Ludwigshafen, there's a couple of other, I think possibly Hamburg and another German city as well. There's a quiet revolution taking place behind the scenes on energy storage that people are just not aware of, and graphene is a bit of an unsung hero at the moment.
So we talked quite a lot about the technology itself, which is fascinating, and we could probably be here for hours. We could have our lunch served to us and keep going and all the rest of it. But what are the other issues within the industries that are doing this? Because you've got to recruit people, you've got to recruit funds, you've got to motivate some very clever and, shall I say, disparate workforces. What are the big issues?
The biggest issue is investment. So governments around the world are not, at the moment, they're not very good at investing in the cutting edge science. Let me give you an example of how it happens. So a typical way a government might assess whether a technology is worth investing in is they'll talk to a panel of experts. So they get the company to submit their idea, and they then go to a panel of experts, and the panel of experts say, yes, this is good, no, it isn't. And then you either get funded or not. And you think that's a pretty logical way of doing things, isn't it? The problem is there's a hidden dysfunctionality in this system, in that if you are right at the edge, the cutting edge of what's possible, the experts are probably the people with the idea in the first place. They know more about this technology than the people who are assessing it do. And I've come across companies who've been turned down for funding because they've had a great idea. It's gone to a panel of experts, and half of the panel say this is a great idea, best thing since sliced bread. It'll make a massive difference, create new jobs, all sorts. But then you've got another half of the panel aren't quite as expert in this field, and they say, no, this won't work. And on average, you end up with a sort of average score, which then some lesser invention, which is more, it's not cutting edge technology, it's more understood by more people, gets a higher score. That gets the government funding, and the cutting edge stuff doesn't. So government funding has some inherent problems there. But also there's another issue, which is private funding, particularly around graphene and manufacturing. Investors, MIT flagged this up about 2 years ago in an article, and they highlighted it quite nicely. Investors at the moment have got conditioned over the last sort of quarter of a century or so of investing in the dot-coms or apps for phones, things like that, where all you need is some geeky guys, you feed them a load of coffee and pizza, give them some powerful computers, relatively cheap and not much capital expenditure, and you come up with well-beating ideas that you can make a lot of money out of. So that investors have sort of grown up understanding that sort of get-rich-quick type of scheme where you don't need to invest much. But manufacturing is different. It's got shorter turnaround. It's got a much longer turnaround than apps and software has. But also, you've got to invest more. It's higher risk and longer term. And a lot of investors run away scared once they start engaging with this. So what you tend to find is investors will pile in, they get really interested, really excited, then they really understand that you've got to invest a lot of money over a long period of time to see the return. And by the way, there's quite a significant amount of risk. This might not work. And all of a sudden you can see there's not a lot of people left who are willing to take those kind of risks. So graphene would be accelerated a lot faster if we get around those two problems. Now, the good thing is there are people out there who are discovering that the real results are happening, and private companies have been investing. I'll give you an example. Ford Motor Company. Now, we're in touch with their global materials people, and we know them quite well. We've met them a few times. They've been so successful with graphene, they just don't talk about this publicly, but there are over 5 million cars with graphene enhanced components inside them on the road right now. They've had the balls to invest in it, and they're reaping the rewards already.
Yeah, the interesting thing about risk is I did one of these sessions with a guy called Samuel West from the Museum of Failure a few weeks ago, and his thing on he has a lot to say about risk and failure, but the one thing that I took away from that was that the companies who are impacted most by failure are the ones who try and avoid it completely.
Very good point.
Because they haven't got the mechanisms in place to cope with failure. Nobody wants to fail, and you try not to.
Yeah.
But if you do, you learn from it and move on. But if you're so scared of meeting failure, then they're the ones. I mean that's what caused Alan Sugar's Amstrad company to go belly up at the time. But
a really important point, managing. It's echoing what I said at the beginning. R&D and working at the cutting edge of stuff is like managing failure. Now there's another ecosystem which I need to tell you about, which is geeky, quite literally. You've probably heard of the Geek where I work. This is the Graphene Engineering Innovation Centre. In fact, at the beginning of this, she had a picture of me standing outside the front door of a building with Graphene Engineering Innovation Centre written on it. That's part of the University of Manchester's campus. It's run by a really smart guy called James Baker, and he's come out of private industry and working right at the cutting edge of what's known and not on the innovation side. He's one of the global experts in innovation. And basically, he set the Geek up as an institution which can manage what's called the Valley of Death. So what that means is if you have a scale going from concept commercialization, so at one end, you've got ideas which universities and bright people will generate, and then at the other end of the scale, you've got industry investing in things and taking off, creating jobs and building the next industrial revolution of the future. The problem is, in the middle, between those bright ideas and industry taking things off, you get to the point where universities and private individuals can invest so much in the technology, but they can't then make the next step to do the big prototypes and the scale up because they haven't got enough money. On the other side, governments and industry haven't got enough confidence that this thing will work because the failure rate's quite high, so they don't invest. So you end up with this gap in the middle, which is called the valley of death, where new inventions just enter a graveyard, and there are lots of stunningly clever ideas out there which would be world changing, which are resting in this graveyard because of this problem. Now, the GEEC is an institution which is the Graphene Engineering Innovation Centre in Manchester, University of Manchester campus, that's where we work. It's deliberately designed to bridge that gap. So we've got private industry coming in, meeting investors, meeting the academics, meeting individuals with great ideas as well. And this is like it's almost like a startup accelerator on steroids. So there are really clever companies being spun out of this all the time now. It's new, only started in 2018, but even in that time, they've had quite notable successes. And graphene in concrete is something that's come from the GEEC. Yeah. And
sounds like they should be selling tickets for visitors with lots of money.
Indeed, yeah, and you do get. We've had quite a few billionaires coming around the GEEC. Yeah.
Sounds interesting. I'll put it on my bucket list then.
I didn't realize you were a billionaire, Derek.
In my dreams. If there's a bucket outside, I'll put a handful of coppers in.
But you're very welcome to come and visit us at the GEEC anyway. We'll give you
sadly, I won't be investing. So unfortunately, we come sort of just about to the end. We've been nattering for 50 odd minutes.
That's gone quick.
It has indeed. So what I'll need to do is show this caption. So there we go. So for people who want to find out more, get in touch. You can visit Nixon Publishing. You can find Adrian on LinkedIn, and you can also have a look at the ISEC website just to prove that it is a real organization and there's real stuff going on. So I have to say thank you, Adrian, for coming along and telling us about. I'll still remember transparent toasters, even if there's more exciting things going on. But all the things that can be done with graphene and 2D materials, what's going on at the GEEC. And seriously, if you're out there, folks, and you've got lots of money, go to the GEEC and hand it over. You'll be doing everyone a favor. So, well, thank you once again, Adrian. And I'm sure we'll be seeing each other fairly soon, or sooner than we think anyway. Okay, thank you again, Adrian. Bye for now.
Pleasure.
Right, so yeah, that's a fascinating topic, fascinating materials, and a fascinating place to go and visit in Manchester. So thank you again to Adrian for telling us about all of that stuff. There will be a replay of this next week, and I'll be back in a fortnight's time with some more interesting stuff. So bye for now. Enjoy the rest of your day.